Nick, what's good, man? Welcome to the show.
Live from the Brass Factory.
We out here.
Yeah, we really need to say that this time.
I just took a lollipop from the communal bucket. I feel like I've embraced this co-working space.
You have. A lot of people don't even do that themselves. They walk past it out of shame.
Man, we're in the Wyclef room. We go hard.
There it is. Well, super excited to have you on the show today, man. What you've been able to accomplish with your own DJ career with Fool's Gold, super impressive. Just to start it off, I mean, you manage a few careers, DJ, label executive. A lot of times people choose one direction or the other, but what made you decide to kind of be involved in both sides there?
I think it's more being open to different opportunities rather than necessarily strategically pursuing any one thing or another. I mean, I've always been interested in a lot of different avenues, and I love music. I love, art, entertainment in all its forms. The things that I've encountered in my life and career have kind of led in this area, but I'm excited to explore even more than that. You know what I mean? Especially as time goes on, you don't want to sort of catch yourself in like a sort of Groundhog Day scenario. And I think that for me, I've always found that if I get sort of, bored or frustrated or not 100% fulfilled in one thing, I'm fortunate that I can kind of like bounce to something else. And, if there's stuff that I'm interested in that I haven't necessarily pursued professionally or as a hobby beforehand, I can kind of like teach myself how to do it. I just want to stay engaged. If I feel like I'm not like super engaged in what I'm doing, it's probably time to like put on a different hat.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wait, can you talk a little bit about the founding story of Fool's Gold? You were at the Fader just before, yeah?
Yeah. So, even how I got involved in the big air quotes music business to begin with, it's kind of a roundabout thing. I was in college. I was going to NYU and I was on the program board.
Nice.
And so we would put on shows and I would do a lot of design, like posters and stuff for these different shows. And that kind of led to being sort of in music on the design side. And, I had a website, so I was, writing stuff, even pre kind of, blogs. It was just literally a website, like I'm on Dreamweaver, like doing coding. And stuff like that. So I was involved in music on a design side and on a writing side. And I was, doing like little blurbs for Turntable Lab in like a new 12-inch comes in, I'd write like a pithy little thing about it. It was all very, kind of, naive and just sort of like, oh, this is a thing I do. It wasn't like, all right, cool. So this is how I'm on this rung of the ladder. And then if I meet this person to do this, like I just was a person who was out and about and, not like, let me go to a networking event. And the people at Fader at the time, I think, stumbled upon stuff that I was doing and just were like, hey, you have a website. You kind of know what this is about. We don't. There's just like a link to subscribe to like the paper magazine to have it sent to your house with, Jordan brand advertisements. So like people are starting websites. Will you start this website for us? And so that led to kind of launching the Fader website and, being on board there as a writer, editor. At the meantime, I'm pursuing design stuff. I'm doing, DJ and music stuff really without a plan so much as like, oh, here are things that I'm doing that I'm getting paid for. And I like them all, to some degree. They're all interesting. They're all new. And I think sometimes new can disguise a lot, but it was super fun and super interesting. And in the midst of all this stuff, I was doing the Fader's radio show on East Village Radio. We were on right before Mark Ronson's show. And This was like, he was still kind of just sort of like New York DJ dude. And he was working with a bunch of unknown artists at the time, Lily Allen, Amy Winehouse. Like the sort of world takeover was still, a couple years ahead. So it was a very fertile time creatively, and a lot of like fun parties were happening in New York. There's a Monday night party at Sway that Roxy Cottontail would throw with, people from, Supreme and, the retail mafia conglomeration of indie streetwear brands at the time. There's just a lot of interesting stuff happening. And I found myself in the middle of a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a party that Roxy booked with me and A-Track DJing. And A-Track at the time, he was this sort of like teen Canadian scratch phenom who, like me, found himself not being a teen anymore and just sort of like, all right, cool. What do I do? Like scratching is cool, but scratching music is kind of, boring. Party music is a lot more fun. And so he, at the same time that he was taking his sort of skill set to a more diverse and fun musical direction, I was kind of taking my skill set wherever it led me. And so we're two, gunslingers, and we'd meet up and sort of realize that all of this stuff that we're doing in these kind of like little scenes that we're a part of, there wasn't really a home for it, in the way that like at the time, Ed Banger was popping off in Paris, and it was like, oh, cool, here's a home for all of the interesting, Parisian, new artists. And it's just like, man, we could do that for our own scene in North America. It's like all of our friends were DJing and starting to make stuff, but there wasn't like an official place for it. It was just sort of like, oh, I'll put this on MySpace. And I think that attitude and that sort of background of kind of like having a lot of different interests and a lot of different abilities, a sort of super diverse Rolodex, and a sort of DJ attitude, really, like, I think in a lot of ways, as much as what we did was, kind of left leaning and experimental on the music side, I think on the philosophical side, it's a very kind of traditional sort of hip hop attitude of like being the freshest, like not biting, being original, and I think that all of those things became the gumbo that 12 years later is still fool's gold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's awesome. So now how do you balance, you actually have a career as a DJ now, and you also own a pretty big label. How do you balance the responsibilities now? It sounds like at the time, a couple were hobbies and a couple of them were things that you kind of like really took seriously and made more money from. But it seems like now all of these things are kind of popping around the same time.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. You know what I mean? That's the realest way to talk about it. Like, it's not something that there is a formula for, because if there was, everybody would do it.
Right.
And especially now as the music industry becomes sort of, math more so than ever before. Like, it's very, very sort of data driven.
Right.
And what's our streaming strategy? Like, what are we on TikTok? Like, what are we doing with this thing that came out, this week? And, I think that in a lot of ways we almost opt out of that element and realize that, hey, you know what? We have a niche that at the end of the day is ours. And we can grow that. Like, we want it to feel like a thing that's open to as many listeners and as many fans as possible. But at the same time, it's not meant to be everything for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
For the people who it is for, we want to overserve that audience.
Right.
And so
right.
I think that attitude of being like, you know what, when this works, it's because we're working hard at being the most us that we can be. That's the way to follow it. And the nice thing about that is that, when stuff works, it's almost like this nice byproduct, as opposed to like this desperate, Glenn Ross kind of like, oh man, we need this record to hit, or else, we can't rent this office anymore. I think that, it changes every year too. You know what I mean? It's like, we've been fortunate in that, over the course of the label, there's been different periods of success and different levels of success. So, for us, the end goal is to be sustainable, to be a thing that, we can all feel like we're growing with personally, like the artists are growing, but the team you rock with at any given season can change. So I think that just sort of like being zen about it, being mature about it, like getting, tighter on the business side. And that just kind of comes through experience, like I think that those kind of things make what we do unique, at least behind the scenes. You know what I mean? Like I can't speak for what it's like being at another label because I've never worked for another label.
Right.
You know, like I've never really worked at a lot of jobs, you know,
Right.
like I've been a freelance dude, and I worked for a magazine for a couple years, and then was, you know, doing my own thing, you know, as an artist and entrepreneur. And so, you know, it's not a path that is for everybody, but I think that for me, you know, each year you figure out how is this going to work for me now, and you know, just trying to do the best job as I can at
one
that,
day at a time.
you know?
One day at a time. So, who are some of the major actors at Fool's Gold? There's obviously you and A-Track, but
Yeah, so you know, we're the two, you know, founders and owners.
Mhm.
A-Track's brother Dave, you know, who's part of Chromeo, you know, he also plays a large role. You know, he gravitates towards the more, I think, aesthetic kind of side of things. So like, you know, the look and feel of the store, you know, is more his brainchild than us. And you know, when we do art shows, recently we did a show with this photographer, Aiden Cullen, who's sort of like interning for us doing photos, and then blew up as the kind of like go-to guy for the Omar Apollos and stuff of the world. Like, you know, he's a really talented dude and built this amazing portfolio, you know, just kind of like being out there and like being part of these scenes. So it was cool to kind of like, you know, be a part of his world and have his first solo photo show in the Fool's Gold store. And we did like a art book for it, you know, like this sort of you know, like perfect bound. It's more than a zine, like it's an actual art book.
Right.
And so that's the kind of project where it's just sort of like, you know, Dave, you shepherd this through, and, you know, this company called Wax Studios did the design of it, you know, under his direction. So it's like, you know, I think that for us in that sort of like triumvirate, you know, we try to kind of do things where like everybody is, you know, working in a complementary way. And that doesn't mean like, oh, you know, we clock in at whatever and, you know, clock out at the end of the day. It's just more like, what kind of access do we each have? What kind of abilities do we each have? And how can we, you know, put them all to work at any given time? Which is easier said than done when people are like traveling around the world for shows, or just being, you know, adults with lives and stuff. But, you know, outside of that kind of creative brain trust, we have a full-time label manager, you know, a full-time in-house accountant, you know, and a full-time store manager. But beyond that, you know, we keep it very lean and just sort of like bring people on for different projects. Mm-hmm. You know, I feel like for us, maintaining that sense of nimbleness, like, hey, you know what? We have too much space in this office. Like, let's rent, you know, a desk out. You know, it's important to do that because, you know, having more people on board doesn't necessarily make for a better experience, especially now when a lot of the roles that a label takes, you know, are changing. And for us, we don't just put out people's music. We have the live side of Fool's Gold. We have the merch, you know, doing more kind of like pure video content kind of things, like hustling for sponsorships. And ultimately, we've built this cool brand, this multifaceted brand that at the end of the day stands for us and our values as, you know, as creatives. So it's like we can use that in any way we see fit. You know, I think that it's just sort of like, hey, is this interesting? Is it dope? Is it raising the bar in some way? Cool, let's pursue it. You know, especially as the music industry itself on a core level changes so much. You know, like if we can kind of keep that lean and effective and make early bets, we don't need to necessarily be like, okay, cool, now we're going to put out your 4th album and this is your product manager who you've never met before. And like, you know, it's the kind of thing where it's like, if people trust us and let us kind of like position the projects in ways we need to, it works super well, you know, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it you know, it becomes like more of like a headbutting situation. Right. So over time, I think we've kind of like learned to see the red flags of that at the early stages
Right.
because they're always there.
Right.
And then try to avoid it. And, you know, we seek out people who kind of understand that. And I try to be as transparent up front with everybody. It's sort of like, hey, look, you know, this is the deal for right now. The deal, you know, next year might be a little bit different. Like, as long as we communicate and as long as we are respectful of what one another is bringing to the table, this will be awesome. And then if it isn't awesome, we'll move on. And put your shit on SoundCloud. Like, it's cool. You know?
Right.
For sure. I think I really like too what you were saying in regards with the art show and showcasing that and the art book. I think one thing you guys have done really well is created a very kind of engaged and loyal and passionate community, which I think is like a super valuable like asset. I mean, there's not people that are like fans of like Universal Music Group, at least at like the consumer level. Whereas you guys, like, I mean, between the parties, between the merch, can you speak as to how you've actually built out that kind of community? What do you think were some of the big factors or things you did that enabled you to create that community?
You know, I think the biggest thing is consistency.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, we've had records that have hit, we've had records that have missed. I can confidently say we haven't had any that have just been like whack.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, just sort of like straight up. There might be stuff that you don't like personally,
Right.
but objectively, you know, I think that there's a through line, you know, through, you know, 250 odd releases that, you know, speaks for itself.
Right.
And I think the same thing goes for the shows, you know, like, we can't book the same people year after year. That gets super boring.
Right.
So, you know, I think that for us, being able to kind of zig and zag and, you know, try to get in front of stuff early
Mm-hmm.
and really just, you know, even the fact that we program the shows ourselves in terms of like the running time and,
Mm-hmm.
and think about like, hey, you know, as DJs, what makes a good set? Like, how can we make this concert feel like a good set?
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, that's something that you feel. You might not notice it. I mean, hopefully you don't see the, you know, the strings being pulled anywhere. You know, like, you want it to be a sort of, you know, seamless experience. But like, we care about stuff. We care about stuff to the point that it's like, we care about the things that don't need to be
Mm-hmm.
cared about at the end of the day. Like, when I have arguments with people, they're about like the font. You know what I mean? Which in the grand scheme of things doesn't make a difference, but in one specific way, it makes all of the difference.
Right.
You know, so like, caring about those little details, you know, for better or worse, is I think what is allowed for a level of consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's not a purely money driven company at the end of the day. Again, for better or worse. Like, it's the kind of thing where it's like, we take something that doesn't have a P&L attached to it. You know what I mean? Like, when Fool's Gold works, you know, when a show brings out an actual community, when it fosters, you know, friendships, you know, people who met one another at a day off, you know, or like songs that exist because people linked at the store, you know, like, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think that we find that rewarding in many ways, that we would do this, you know, even in times when it's down, you know, like, all of this stuff is the roller coaster curve.
Yeah.
And I think that the people who stick around are the ones who kind of like know how to like take stock of shit when you're on the dip portion, because nobody's, you know, peaking forever.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. That actually kind of leads us to a question that me and Sam were wondering earlier. Is you guys started the label kind of at a time where labels at the time seemed like they were on the way out. You know, people were kind of freaking out, you know, so what
07.
Yeah. So like,
shift
what
to streaming.
Right. And people are like, music's not going to make money anymore. All this stuff that is now actually proven to be wrong. But what made you place an early bet on an indie label at the time and like creating an indie label? Or did you even think about it? Or was it just like, dude, we should just do it? Like, fuck it.
I don't think we thought about it in terms of like industry trends necessarily, because we always felt and still do feel like outsiders in a lot of ways. You know, like the label launched with Kid Sisters Project because, you know, A-Track produced a lot of those records and would be bringing them around to traditional labels, and they didn't understand it. They were like, well, this is hip hop, kind of. This is, dance, kind of. This is pop, kind of. Like it's all of these things. If it was just one of those things, cool. Here's your budget. Like we understand how to put it out. Now, a decade and change later, you have the Pollen playlist on Spotify. You have festivals that, cater to this different kind of hybrid audience. When we started Day Off, the only hip hop festival was like Rock the Bells, and it was, for dads, and like no offense, like it was an older audience.
Right.
Now, we're at the point where it's like we're aging, and the artists who we started with are getting older too. And so, for us, the challenge is not about being new, but like connecting the dots between these generations in a way that, like, when we started, it was more kind of like segregating in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
We always wanted to bring people together. Like, we love new stuff. We love old stuff. You know what I mean? I very much consider myself a student of music, a student of the game, like I like learning. I like, coming up on, just things I hadn't heard before, stuff that will surprise me. And sometimes that's a record from the 70s. Sometimes that's some new thing that just came out yesterday, like if it's dope, it's dope. Like my dad is a history teacher, I feel like that's the kind of thing that's in my blood. You know what I mean? Like I would be psyched being a librarian somewhere, you know what I mean? But I'm the DJ librarian.
Right. It's just a natural curiosity. Awesome.
So as the industry has evolved, and you're seeing a lot more independent record labels emerge. Like, what do you think are the key elements or kind of core value propositions of very good labels? I think artists are often trying to like evaluate between some, and some are more innovative than others. But from your perspective, what do you think are the key value props?
On paper, I still believe that it all starts with the music. You know what I mean? Like for me anyway, I need it to be good. Yeah. I need it to be music that I actually like. I need it to be music that I objectively feel is interesting.
Yeah.
In practice, that's not the number one reason why stuff is successful.
Right.
It's a portion of it. If you make it to a certain point, like that's the thing that will keep you in. Mm-hmm. But it's not the first thing that gets people attention in the sort of viral world, and that's not new to today. Like in the 50s, it's like, oh, this kid has a cool haircut, and he's got a catchy song. Like that's let's press it on a 45 and take it to the sock hop. Like that attitude has been in the music business since inception. And now I feel like it's as true as it's ever been, but there's also different lanes. Like you don't have to just be immediately like, oh, I want to blow up and have this sort of, surprise song and like go from my bedroom to Billboard Awards or whatever. You can carve out a niche that is just more like, no, this is for the heads only, or find a happy medium, but you do have to find a way to make yourself stand out. And whatever your route is, find a way to own it, because you can't do it halfway. And that said, I think that when stuff is successful, it's because everybody's kind of pulling their weight. So with the question of like, whether or not to sign with a label or work with a label, if you're really motivated and organized, you could do all of that stuff yourself. If you have a manager or a management team that's on point and knows their shit and understands these different avenues and all the different possible bags to that are out there, great. They can be your label.
Right.
For us, we want to be a creative partner as much as a business one. So if you want to work with us, you need to want a degree of input.
Right.
And, I think that our success stories over the years have been where Fool's Gold is overproducing. The management is overproducing. The PR, the booking agent, first and foremost. You know what I mean? Like everybody's kind of making different opportunities happen, and you have something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And, when something doesn't work, everybody kind of wants to point the finger elsewhere, but it's sort of like, hey, you know what? Even this could have been something where everybody's kicking ass and it just doesn't connect with listeners. It just kind of is what it is. Like if anyone who says that they can predict it, I don't have a lot of trust.
Right.
And, all of these situations are different. So it's like, you have to understand the situation that works best for you at this point. I think a lot of artists get worried about signing deals way too early. It's sort of like, oh, you don't have any fans yet. You're not connecting with the audience. Even if we put all of our muscle behind that, what's it going to do? Who's going to listen to it? It's the Spotify stream falling in the woods. Like who's going to be there to hear it?
Right.
So again, or you're an artist that's super established. Maybe you haven't had a record that's resonated in a long time. Do you need a deal in order to do that? No, you already have the amount of fans that you're going to get. Like, give them something that they really love. You don't need a label to do that. But let's say you want to try something different. You want to try a curveball. You want to try a surprise. We love those opportunities because it lets us kind of say, like, what is an interesting juxtaposition for this artist that didn't exist otherwise? Here's someone who people think is only one thing. Oh, but we could flip it and have the art look like this and pair them with this producer and do that. But as an artist, you have to be open to that. You have to want it. So everybody's situation is different. And as a artist and as a label owner, I see both sides. And I think that you just have to think about what works for you. And it's trial and error. You can't put all of your hopes and dreams in one release, especially now, where music on a sort of base level has less value than ever before, outside of artistic value and just personal, like, I enjoyed this experience, which is, I think a hard thing for people to grasp. And like me saying one thing doesn't cancel out the other. But from a purely business perspective, if something doesn't work, you figure out the next thing.
Yeah.
It's time spent being like, oh, this thing didn't work. What is that doing for anybody?
Right.
I mean, other than sort of having the mindset of being like, hey, you know what? This next go around, let's try a slightly different strategy. Like, you can't expect different results from doing the same shit.
Right. Totally. In that same vein, I mean, you were speaking to some characteristics of artists and traits. I'm curious as to, you've had so much exposure to artists that have made it. Some artists may have had all the right traits and maybe everything looked like they were set up for massive success, but it didn't necessarily take off. I'm curious as to what you've observed as some of the most important traits for artists to nurture if they want to succeed.
Especially at Fool's Gold.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we're fortunate in that, like, there's nobody who I can really look back and be like, oh man, fuck that guy. But, at the same time, it's like, there's different personality traits all throughout music. Like that's, I think that the people who are dynamic on stage and who make really compelling records are wired in a way that makes them not necessarily like a email CC'er, like it shouldn't be that way. But, again, when it works, I think everybody's doing their thing and everybody's on point. When it doesn't work, there's some kind of breakdown in the communication process, usually. Some people are lovable assholes. Some people are just assholes. And, I think that, treating people right goes a long way. And a mediocre artist with a great attitude is going to go further than a great artist with a shitty attitude. That's just how it goes. Like, you can't just be talented, and expect that that's going to open doors for you. You have to be motivated. You have to be, you have to be crafty, just because there's too much stuff out there.
Right.
And if you want to cut through that noise, it's not just going to be because you're good at what you do, because a lot of people are good at what they do. And then there's people who aren't good at what they do, but will watch a YouTube video where, a Russian teenager will teach them how to be better at what they do. And they're working on their craft and they're learning and they're trying things that they didn't try before. Yeah. So, a lot of stuff has to go with motivation. And look, sometimes stuff doesn't pan out. And some people take that really personally. Some people, will flip that and be like, oh, this is your fault why this didn't work out.
Right.
And first of all, me as a person, if you feel that way, we can talk about it. You know, like I've had the same phone number since I was in high school. I'm very reachable, you know, and I'm like a reasonable person. That said, you know, let's say a deal is a profit share, as many of ours are, where it's a 50-50 split on any profit. You know, that means we're partners in this. Right. Even if we're fronting all of the money for it, we're still, you know, true partners at the end of the day. So even if something, you know, crashes and burns in spectacular fashion, and again, I'm speaking hypothetically. I feel like we generally do a good job. And even if something fails, you know, I have no problem owning that. Though, let's be real, I will own 50% of that. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like again, nothing works when it's one-sided. You know what I mean? Like, and again, stuff that's truly successful, as much as there may be people who will try and claim all of that success, it's always a team effort. Always 110%. You know, and I'm proud of the fact that, like, you know, I feel like, you know, we've been able to put together good teams over the years. And when things work, it works because everybody's, you know, in a good state of mind and working hard.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. How do you think the A&R process has changed for you from when you started the label until today? Or if it's changed at all?
You know what? I think that over the years, there may have been periods where we've tried different things, sometimes for the better, sometimes for less than the better, you know. When it works, I think it's when we're super true to ourselves and we're saying, like, what is the most interesting creative choice we can make here, as opposed to like, what's happening in the world and what don't we have? You know, like, I think you need a degree of that, but it's like spices, you know. It's like too much oregano is gonna fuck it up, like too much nutmeg and like this shit is inedible. Like, you know, you just a little bit of that spice in your mindset, I think, is healthy. And it's just figuring out that balance. And, you know, I think that for us, the stuff that works has been the stuff where we're like, man, this is so weird and nobody's doing it. Nobody sounds like Danny Brown. Let's put out Danny Brown. You know, like nothing sounds like, you know, Flosstradamus right now. Let's put that out. You know, nobody sounds like Kid Sister. Nobody da. And, you know, I think that that's still the sort of guiding principle. You know, sometimes it can just be harder to make that stuff connect when it's in a vacuum. You know what I mean? Like, it can't just be us liking something in the clout era. You know what I mean? Like, it can't just be like, oh, this is cool. You know, that's just something that we can put on the Spotify playlist. You know what I mean? Like, you know, it's not something where it's like, hey, let's invest our time and effort and money into this release or this person's career. Like, that, I think, is a slightly different alchemy, and it's, you know, it's unique in every case. I like when we can make early bets that don't require, you know, an initial, you know, outlay of capital. Like, it's just more like, hey, you know what? We believe in this. Let's just put this out there. We'll, you know, the art will be cool. Like, we'll provide a context. Cause I think that that's the biggest thing, context, you know, and sometimes that's as simple as a cosign. A cosign is a form of context for why you should care about something, why you should listen for something. And, you know, that comes in a lot of different forms, but, you know, a lot of times people are just gems in the wild. And you know, we try and just, you know, have a good batting average when it comes to picking them.
For sure. I mean, you've made some great picks. I feel like Kid Cudi, you guys were one of the earliest. How'd you come across him?
Yeah, you know, that was just one of those things where it's like personal relationships. You know, Cudi's working at the Bape store and, you know, like linking with Plain Pat, and Pat believes in him and, you know, gives records to A-Track, who he knows from, you know, Kanye touring stuff. And, you know, A-Track and I listen to the music. We're sort of like, oh man, there's something about this song. Like, it's weird. There's no beat really. Like, he's singing. And, and I think that, you know, as we're listening to the Day and Night demo, it's just sort of like, you know what? 2 days later, I'm still thinking about this song. 3 days later, I'm still thinking about the song. So we have this sort of like, oh, what's the deal? You know, how does it fit? Will DJs play it? Like, because it's not obvious. It's not an obvious kind of record, but he's a magical dude, you know? And that magic is present in that record. And so I think that for us, it was just sort of like, hey, you know what? This has it. We believe in it.
Right.
You know, and it was harder to put out one-off little singles back then. You know what I mean? It's like we pressed vinyl up, you know, like that's expensive. And you know, there's no TuneCore.
Right.
You know, it was just a different kind of dynamic. But there was something about it where it was like, you know what, this is worth trying.
Right.
Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. Like there's been tons of songs in the last 12 years that are sort of like, man, this is something cool. And it doesn't really go beyond that.
Right.
You know, and that's no dig on the artist or the song.
Right.
Just if something's really dope, there's no sell by date. And it'll be rediscovered one day. You know, when we're doing like the Fool's Gold 30th anniversary compilation, you know, there's going to be tons of records that people fronted on and now it's like, oh my God, they're so forward thinking and did it. It's like, well, where were you when we needed to sell it? Like, you know, but all this stuff is, you know, it's what's the word I'm looking for? Not flimsy, but in the scheme of life, like it doesn't actually matter,
right?
You know, and so I think that that's a healthy attitude to take, where it's just sort of like, hey, you know what? Let's not get so tied up in, you know, the weirdness of it, and just be pure and just be enthusiastic, and let that enthusiasm try and, you know, keep stuff going. Ephemeral. All this stuff is ephemeral. And I think that in an ephemeral world, the fact that we've made something lasting, I think speaks to the spirit behind it.
Yeah. No.
Not to be, you know, all goop about it.
Right.
Shout out to Gwyneth.
I want to hear some stories. So like, you've obviously worked at Fool's Gold for a while. You've worked with a lot of different artists. Like what are some of your most interesting stories, whether that be the artists and just how they ended up working with Fool's Gold, or the artist stories themselves? Or
yeah, I mean, I think the interesting stories tend to congeal around like the day off shows. You know what I mean? Like it's funny. Like there was definitely a point a few years ago where it used to be that, like, you know, the person backstage with face tats was gonna perform. And then everybody just had face tats. So it becomes a sort of like thing where it's like, if everybody has face tats, like, does anybody actually have face tats? You know, like it's very, very existential. But day off is interesting because day off, again, it's like, you know, you have entourages, you know what I mean? And it's crazy, especially when it's like people who no one even knows yet. Sort of like, you know, nobody knew who Trippie Redd was, but he showed up with like 20 dudes and was a real fucking headache. You know what I mean? But it was a cool moment. Right. You know what I mean? And you look back and it's like, oh wow, this is as the moment that somebody's blowing up into something.
Yeah.
And this show was the, you know, catalyst for it in some way. You know, like those kind of things. Like that's, I think, where like the more like crazy stories come in, the more, you know, world star worthy.
I was there
stories.
for one.
Like
the Lil Yachty Fool's Gold Day Off. It was like early on as his ascent, dude, and the crowd control. First of all, it was crazy lit.
The backstory of that was we were going to do Day Off at this helipad on 34th Street, like right by the water. And the night before the show, as everybody's getting there to like literally build the stage and set stuff up, this helicopter makes an emergency landing right in front of where the stage was going to go.
Right.
So we're like, what the fuck is this? Like, what do you do? Well, you learn what you can't do, because like with FAA regulations and stuff, if something makes an emergency landing, it can't be moved until it's been checked out and okayed by, you know, a certified mechanic. Like we literally couldn't like lift it up with a crane and move it out of the way so we could put on the show. It was just there. And so like the conspiracy part of your brain is moving. Is like, did someone just like do this because like they didn't want the thing to happen? Like they were worried about like, you know, rappers or what have you. So it was just a nightmare. But fortunately, you know, I think everybody who we do stuff with has a can-do spirit. And so Irv from Brunch Bounce, who's a longtime partner who we work with on events, A-Track's management teamwork, Andrew from Teamwork, and Irv, you know, they went into super scramble mode. They were like, oh, well, there's this beer garden in Queens that we went to. And so they found the place. The beer garden was like, you know what? We don't have anything going on in the morning. but when UFC starts, you got to go because your people have bought their tickets. And in a matter of hours, we moved the show to this space in Queens. So it's sort of like, okay, this event can live.
Yeah.
Now, can it stay alive? It becomes the question of the night. And so for the most part, there's no real backstage kind of headaches. There's no real overcrowding headaches. Like we've had stuff shut down because of too many people in the past. Like when we were doing Day Off at this parking lot behind City Winery, the year that French Montana played, like kids were gate crashing and like climbing over the fence. Somebody climbed over the fence and like fell through a porta potty and like, that got shut down before French could even perform. Damn. So that sucked. Like that was literally shut down by the police. With Yachty, it was a little bit of a different story because it was teetering on the verge of shutdown, not even because it was legally doing anything wrong, just because, the authorities have the right to just say like, hey, you know what? You're done. They can do that.
Shit's getting too wild.
So, he actually got to finish his set though. So, the Migos did not, and they were, rightfully bummed about that. And, again, that's the kind of thing where it's like A-Track's personal friends with them. And like, he's out there not just as a label owner and a concert thrower, but just as like a homie. And so, that it becomes awkward, but if you own up to everything and if you're straightforward with people and you're not trying to bullshit people or pass the buck, none of this stuff matters. You know what I mean? Sort of like, hey, you know what? This is how this played out. Wasn't how we wanted it to, but here we are. Let's figure it out. Totally. You always have to approach shit with the attitude of let's figure it out. And if somebody doesn't want to figure it out, well, fuck them. You don't want to figure it out in the first place.
Yeah, for sure.
But 99.9% of the time, we have a positive outlook on things, and I think that shows in the product, whether it's a record or a show or a T-shirt. Yeah, like this stuff is made with love because there's no reason to make it otherwise. And, I think that's what keeps this going year after year.
That's what I try to teach my interns the most out of anything. It's like anything that I ask you to do, just assume that there's some sort of solution and that you're just here to find it. But, they at first it's like they're nervous. I ask them to do small things and they come back to me like, I don't know how to do it. Like, can you teach me? I'm like, well, did you look it up on these resources yet? Like, how much did you
consult
actually
the
try?
Computer in your pocket?
Exactly. So I think that's like a huge thing in any field, really. It's like there is a solution. I just have to find it. I think that's a valuable thing to learn and to teach people for sure. Yeah. That's
awesome. It was cool too, because I think even for Migos, like you guys also threw a party with Migos like 4 years prior or something.
With two of three.
Was that
two Migos only?
That was when
Offset was locked up.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like all of this stuff. It's a community at the end of the day. Even when people move on to become like huge celebrities and whatnot, like it's all part of a larger thing. And the people you see on the way up will be the people you see on the way down.
Yeah. How impactful do you think the Fool's Gold Day Off has been in nurturing your community? Like, I feel like that's powerful. Like, not only is it a good revenue stream for the business, but it creates community in real life environment. Like,
yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the premier thing we do every year. And I think that it's the kind of thing where it's like, it's not tied into whatever releases we're putting out. Although we do try to showcase as many sort of new artists as we can. And now, the challenge is that we're not the only game in town.
Right.
Like every brand wants to put money behind like, a Boiler Room type thing.
Right.
And, you have the sort of mega like Rolling Loud kind of festival. Yeah. So, year in and year out, it's not it's not just who's fun to book. Like, it's not just like the fantasy baseball element of it, but also like, man, as a concert venture, how do you separate yourself?
Totally.
And sometimes that's not even an easy answer. I mean, like, luckily, the brand is strong and, that counts for a lot, but it doesn't count for everything. And so, it's fun working on this year's because I think that sense of like, hey, it's getting crowded out here, it will force more interesting decisions just on some pressure makes diamonds shit.
Right. How do you think being a musician yourself interacts with you being a label executive and vice versa? Like, are you ever like, damn, I want to work with this artist, but I also like want to sign this artist, or like,
maybe if I sign him, he'll work with me.
Yeah, like do they ever interact with each other?
Sometimes it can be difficult because you never want to be in a situation where people think that like you just want to put your fingerprints on stuff,
right?
Like and make it like oh this is your record, now it's my record, That's and I think some of that is just you getting to know people, you know what I mean, and I'm the last person to make those kind of suggestions. That said, if you seek out those suggestions, my experience, in that world is valuable. I think the biggest thing from a label, the artist input on the label side of what I do is I think having more empathy in terms of like, hey, you know what? It sucks when you're waiting to put music out that in your mind is finished and you don't know why. So it's like, hey, you know what? Let's go the extra step and explain like, hey, this is why this unmastered music you sent over last night can't come out tomorrow. Right. Because XYZ, da-da-da. Which, might seem obvious, but if you're a brand new artist and this is the first label you've ever dealt with, the first situation, that extra step is important. And kind of having been on the other side of that, of like turning in music and never knowing when it's going to happen, when you're doing a remix for some, giant label or whatever, you're completely at the mercy of when they feel like dropping that. Sort of like, hey, you know what? I know what this feels like. I don't want you to be bummed out about it because I'm not like explaining stuff.
Right.
That actually just happened to me the other day. One of my artists did a remix, and then all of a sudden he just texted me and was like, yo, did they tell you it was coming out? I was like, no. And then he was like, it's out. I was like, what? It's out?
all kinds of stuff. And the same thing with DJing. You know what I mean? It's like you experience some of the greatest shows ever, or you experience some of the actual worst ones. And so it's like knowing that like all of this is a spectrum and sort of like, hey, you know what? This can kind of fall anywhere on it. I want to make sure that as much as I can, your experiences fall on the good side. And if it's not going to, if it looks like there's something that might be problematic, like explaining it, you know what I mean? Like, I think that when you have experience, you might take for granted that other people don't have it. And so it's just sort of like, hey, you know what? Over the course of your career, if you stick with this, you will experience the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And so the challenge is maintaining through all of them, not getting crazy, jump off a bridge, dejected when something doesn't go the way you thought it would, and not being super gassed when you're on top and everybody wants to give you money for stuff,
right?
Because both those things cancel one another out on the spectrum. And what you're left with is, did you enjoy the process? And so as long as you enjoy the process, it works. Even for me, it's like when I'm making music, I try not to think about the business element of it. I try not to think about the release element of it, which can be difficult because that's what I'm doing day in and day out. I try to be like, hey, you know what? Am I having fun making this, or do I feel like it's an obligation? If I feel like it's an obligation, it's like, you know what? Fuck this. I want to watch a movie. But if I'm having fun, it's like, oh, great, cool. This is why I'm doing this. I like the learning aspect a lot. Like I like when I can feel myself getting better. Like it's very, Matrix, like, I know Kung Fu, like I know baseline. So like, you pick stuff up. That to me is a really satisfying feeling. Like I've gotten more into the video and animation side of stuff because that's a thing I have an interest in. Like, aside from all the music stuff I do already, like I really love, writing and directing, and that's something that I hope to am pursuing, and as I learn things and I get better at that, and sort of like, oh, I'll make a video for a single I have coming out, oh, hey, this is better than the last one. That feeling of this is better than the last one counts for a lot. And so I'm just kind of like chasing that in terms of my personal work.
Nice.
Sometimes you have to push through the stuff that's not fun. Yeah. Can you talk about that experience, and also how you mean, because you've been at it. I mean, you guys, 2005 is when you guys technically were founded?
2007 is 2007? The first one. That's what we celebrate.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, 12 years at this point. I'm sure there's been moments where it's been a lot mentally, physically. Can you talk about kind of pushing through those?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, for me, like, I'm a married dude, know, and I think that having a sort of stable personal life is really important because it allows me to just kind of like detach and realize that like, hey, you know what? This stuff is not that deep.
Right.
Let me not get so fired up about whatever random challenge of the day it is and bring that energy home with me because that's not fun for everybody. So it's like being able to kind of like keep stuff at arm's length, is something that you have to, train yourself to. I'm fortunate in that like I'm a generally positive person. Like it's not like difficult. Like I don't have to go to therapy for that stuff, which is not to knock therapy. If you need it, get it. But that sort of like having some semblance of boundaries, which, isn't the easiest thing to do when you own your business / are your business. So that's I think first and foremost, just kind of splitting up sort of like, hey, this is work and then this is Nick. And sometimes those two things coincide, sometimes they don't. As far as just other challenges, over the years, you may find yourself in a situation where it has nothing to do with you and it sucks, or it doesn't turn out like, the way you thought it would be. Like, we're going to sign this distribution deal. And everybody's like, oh, hey, well, with our muscle and know-how and experience, we'll take you from here to here. And then when you don't get to there, or you have the first thing that kind of like doesn't do what you thought it would do, they're like, oh, these attitudes are a little bit different. Like these emails are returned with less speed than before. You know, it's like, and you realize like, oh, we're not the priority that we thought we would be. And so like, those kind of situations, when you experience them the first time, what to avoid in the future. And knowing like, hey, you know what? This phrase in this contract really means this. So when we do another contract, we make sure that it also has this phrasing to allow us to like being able to kind of have like that sort of pocket knife mentality of like, hey, you know what? This didn't work. So flip through it. Oh, now this will work.
Right.
And that even goes towards like DJing and stuff like that too. You know what I mean? The biggest thing I try to teach people when they ask me for like DJ advice is just sort of like troubleshooting essentially. like, oh, when your computer does this, do this, and keep this cord with you in case it totally shits the bed. Like, So I think that again, problem solving mindset. You know what I mean? None of this stuff is really that deep. So if you're true to your word and you keep that attitude of like, you know what, we'll figure it out. Any challenge is conquerable.
Yeah. And then I want to tie that into what you, in the beginning of the conversation, you said, if you feel ever like you're not engaged in something, that's a good sign to you that it's time to take that next step. How do you balance the two of knowing when to persevere versus knowing when it's time to shift or evolve your role to move your focus away from X thing because it's not engaging anymore?
Yeah.
That's a pretty good question because I'm actually wondering that about myself too.
There's no right or wrong answer because on the one hand, you need to feel a personal investment in things. On the other hand, you can't take shit personally because it'll kill you.
Right.
And so knowing what that balance is, I think it's different in every situation. But I think that when you've been through something that kind of sucked, your gut tells you, oh, it's this again. And so it's a question of, do you listen to your gut or not?
Right.
And I would say your gut is generally right. And, you can't have like this sort of scarcity mindset. You know what I mean? Like there's always going to be new shit to work on.
Right.
There's always going to be new artists to work with, new songs to put out. So it's like, don't let any one thing, become a roadblock. And which isn't to say don't try and fix stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's very easy to just be like, oh, this didn't really work out. Like I'm going to bail. But just, don't feel like you've kind of like let yourself out there more than you're getting back.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you realize like, oh shit, you know, we haven't been working together. I've just been doing mad favors,
Right.
you know, like,
Right.
and nothing happens in return. I you know, you can't be like super cold about stuff, but you can be clear-eyed. And I think that those things are similar, but very different.
Right.
And, you know, you don't want to find yourself in a position where you're like making decisions because like you feel bad for somebody. You know what I mean? Like we're all human beings. We're all sensitive, you know, but that can't be sort of like, yeah, you know, I heard this crazy sob story and now we're putting out an EP, you know, like
Totally.
it's and sometimes you feel shitty about that, but you know, from a business perspective, it's like, hey, you know what? 3 or 4 of those moments, and then you don't have money to put out new things. And it's sort of like, and you knew from the beginning that it was going to have problems.
Yeah.
So again, listening to your gut early, you know, I think is helpful. But you don't learn those lessons until you've been through it.
Yeah.
So you fuck up.
Yeah.
So you aren't clear-eyed.
Oh,
yeah.
but to that note, I think it's great to fuck up early. You know, especially like for people who are just starting out in their career, you know what I mean? Like learn as much as possible, take chances, fuck up early and hopefully on somebody else's dime, you know what I mean? Like, you know, like just because no one knows everything, you know, but if you make a mistake, you own up to it, you learn from it, you figure it out, you know?
Yeah. It's dope. I like that. So we got some hot takes.
Yeah, man, let's do it.
Oof.
So hot takes are pretty much just a section of our podcast where we try to say something controversial to you to see how you respond.
Okay.
So it's just supposed to stoke thought. So the first hot take: artists who run their own labels can't do it unbiasedly.
I think that is true in the sense that like if you're an artist running a label, you should be doing it with some kind of point of view. You know, I think a lot of times people, you know, have used the phrase like vanity label, almost like a diss. You know, like I remember when Madonna launched like Maverick Records back in the day, like people called it like, oh, this is Madonna's vanity label. But lo and behold, her manager super has his shit together and they sign Alanis Morissette and the Prodigy and it's like, oh, well, who's the vanity label now? You know, I do think that a label, much like an artist, needs to justify their existence because there's just too many of both.
Right.
So if you're going to do it, what is the reason behind why you're doing it? Not just you can't just be like, I want to support new artists. Okay, but what kind of artists? You know, you have to define what you do and why you do it. Or else you're just kind of you're going to find yourself treading water. Like having that kind of like mission statement, that elevator pitch of like, this is why we are us and why we're not them. You have to have that. And so if that reads as bias, you know, maybe it is, but it is for the right reasons.
Right.
You know, I don't think bias is necessarily a bad thing. It just needs to be put in a proper context.
Right, right.
I like that for sure.
Yeah. It was a good answer to the hot take. It's a cold take now.
All right, the next one. Major labels are being disrupted by independent labels.
I think that it is as disrupted as any other part of the music business is until it's then engulfed into the system. And I don't think that one is necessarily better or worse than the other. You know, I think, you know, the idea that they're sort of adversarial in some way is a little outdated. I think that it is the kind of thing where it's like, as an artist at whatever stage you're at in your career, you have to make the decision of what makes the most sense for me. And, you know, I think a lot of labels of all sizes, major labels, independent labels, operate from a very reactionary standpoint of almost like, hey, well, you're turning this into me. You know, you did your record and you made your artwork and did it, and you're just presenting this, and we're essentially a distributor. You know, and like that is, you know, boring, right? But it works sometimes. And I think a lot of people find themselves in both those ways. That said, there's independent labels, you know, who will give input and hone things and make suggestions and help craft a product that, didn't exist before in that sort of format. And so do major labels.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think that, there's a sort of assembly line, attitude in different places that certain artists find very distasteful. And then other people have, made millions of dollars being a cog in that, assembly line. So it has to be like, hey, you know what? Is this what I'm built for? Or is it not? Everybody's situation is different. I don't knock anybody who's out there trying to make it happen for them. I think that if you're doing it from an honest place and you're not screwing people over to get there, like there's enough opportunities for everybody. It's like you just have, the challenge is finding the opportunity that's yours.
Right. I like that. So I guess one last question to be hard because we got lots of questions. We could sit here and ask questions all day, but I mean, I think a lot of the people that listen to the show are either aspiring artists or managers, potentially even running their own labels. I mean, we spoke to the traits for artists that you see amongst artists that start to succeed, but like, what should early stage artists be focusing on when it comes to like building a sustainable career?
I think that everybody across the board who makes it to the next stage did it with fans. They didn't do it with investors. They didn't do it with, muscle behind them. They did it because they made a thing that people liked. And so if you're starting out and no one likes it, that could be a couple things. That could be you're not doing a good enough job of sharing it. You're not putting yourself out there in the way you have to. You're not being open to feedback. Like there's something is blocking people from getting at it. And a lot of times people will come to us and just be like, oh, cool. Well, you'll be able to put my stuff worldwide. And it's like, yeah, but like, do you even have friends? You know what I mean? Like, are you your friend's favorite artist? Like, do your cousins bang your shit? Like, I think that a lot of people don't ask those basic questions of just sort of like, hey, do the most immediate people around me care about what I do? Right. Because all of these things, it's like circles of a tree. You know what I mean? Like it grows out from the inside. So any career starts with fans. It starts with like somebody likes it. Maybe I'm one of those fans. You know what I mean? But don't sell me on what your deal is. Let me become a fan of what you do. You know? And if you can't even do that, like you don't have to send me demos every week. You know what I mean? Like I always tell everybody, it's like, hey, you know what? This is pretty cool, but I don't hear about you. You know what I mean? Like I don't see you talking to artists and vice versa. Like, stuff can't exist in a vacuum. And when it does, it's so transcendently good that it would have blown up anywhere. Most stuff is not that, especially in the beginning. And we're in a weird part of the bell curve in that like the middle area, everything is more or less fine. When I come across something that's super shitty, I'm almost as psyched as when I come across something that's amazing because I'm like, how did you do that? You know what I mean? Like most stuff is fine, which translates to forgettable. Right. And so, when everything is fine, it's sort of like figuring out how do I get further along to that undeniable side, that amazing side. And if stuff is just fine, it's like, cool. You don't need me to be, a player in that story. Yeah. Awesome. Any last thoughts, Jordan?
No, man, that was good. That was good.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Nick. I mean, super excited for your continued success.
We put it down in the Wyclef room.
Yeah, we did. We did. Shout out Wyclef.
Boom. Thank you, man.
I appreciate it.